My name is Lotus. I am 27 years old and I live in Houston, Texas. James didn't even look up from his measuring tape when he destroyed my dream. I had just gotten home, the dust and sweat of the construction site still clinging to my shirt. Everything felt like a normal Tuesday, until he wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at me with bored eyes. "Lotus, I declined that Germany email of yours," he said casually. "We are knocking this wall down. Oriana needs a VIP dressing room," Flora chuckled. Oriana smirked, adjusting her designer sunglasses. They waited for me to nod and accept it. But the man in the high-visibility vest standing next to me didn't smile. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. They thought Nathan was just a lowly laborer. They had no idea who he really was. Before I tell you how this fake empire crumbled, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I did not scream. I did not throw my hard hat against the freshly painted drywall or demand to know how they had bypassed the password on my laptop. Over the years, I had learned that reacting to James and Flora only fed their egos. Anger was a currency in this house, and I refused to spend another dime on them. I walked slowly past James, my heavy steel-toed boots leaving a faint trail of pale Texas dust on Flora's pristine white rug. Flora gasped, taking a step back, as if the very dirt on my boots might infect her, but I ignored her. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. The email was right there. It was from the Munich engineering firm, the one I had spent 6 months interviewing for. The bold red letters of the sent folder confirmed the worst. A polite, formal refusal sent from my own address typed by my own father. I calmly reached out and closed the laptop lid. The soft click echoed in the suddenly quiet room. Oriana shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her smirk faltering just a fraction. She expected a meltdown. She wanted me to cry so she could record it and post about her unstable sister. I simply turned around and walked back out the front door. The humid Houston air hit my face, a stark contrast to the aggressive air conditioning inside. Sitting on the bottom step of the porch, clutching a worn-out backpack that looked entirely too big for her, was Lily. She was 5 years old with huge, watchful eyes that had seen far too much neglect, Oriana's daughter. While her mother was inside demanding a larger dressing room for clothes she didn't pay for, Lily was waiting outside in the heat, hoping her aunt would bring her a cold juice box from the site. When she saw me, she stood up quickly. Brushing the dust off her knees, Nathan stepped forward. His heavy work boots crunched softly against the gravel. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me that everything was going to be fine. He just reached out and took my hand. His palm was rough, calloused from lifting steel and pouring concrete, but his grip was the most grounding force I had ever known. I looked down at Lily, then up at Nathan. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. I was completely calm. The kind of calm that comes just before a hurricane makes landfall. I walked over to Lily, picked up her little backpack, and offered her my free hand. We walked toward my beat-up truck, leaving the three of them standing inside their crumbling illusion of wealth. They thought they had won. They thought they had trapped me here forever, destined to be the financial pillar of their fabricated lives. That night, at 11:30 p.m., I opened the most tightly locked drawer in my room. It was time to use it. My alarm always went off at 4 in the morning. It was a harsh, unrelenting sound, but it was the only way I could stay ahead of the crippling debt James and Flora had forced onto my shoulders. $80,000. That was the price tag of Oriana's failed cosmetic venture 3 years ago. When the creditors came knocking, James and Flora had conveniently remembered my existence, begging me to co-sign the loans to save the family name. I did it, but I learned my lesson. By 5 in the morning, I was already strapped into a safety harness, climbing steel utility poles while the Houston sun slowly baked the city. My hands were calloused, my muscles aching by noon. Every paycheck I earned went directly to the bank, methodically chipping away at the debt that wasn't mine. Meanwhile, back at the house, a completely different reality played out. Oriana rarely woke up before noon. While I was tightening bolts 50 feet in the air, she was setting up ring lights in the living room. She spent her afternoons filming unboxing videos, tearing into expensive designer bags and shoes, paid for by James's maxed-out credit cards, and Flora's endless enabling. They called it investing in her personal brand. They told their country club friends that Oriana was on the verge of massive fame, while completely ignoring the fact that my sweat was the only thing keeping the electricity turned on so she could charge her camera. The cruelty in that house was never physical. It was atmospheric. It was the way Flora would serve Oriana freshly pressed juice while stepping over my muddy work boots without a word. It was the way James would boast about Oriana's follower count, but tell his friends I was just going through a tomboy phase. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as the foundation they could step on to elevate her. But my greatest heartbreak wasn't how they treated me. It was how they treated Lily. Later that afternoon, the site foreman let Lily sit safely behind the chain-link fence, waiting for my shift to end. The sun was dipping low, casting long golden shadows across the scattered steel beams. She sat perfectly still on an empty paint bucket, her small hands resting on her knees. I climbed down, wiped the grease from my face, and handed her a cold bottle of water. She took it with both hands, her big eyes looking up at me. Oriana says I am a heavy burden blocking her from marrying a rich man, Lily said, her voice small and innocent. She took a tiny sip of water. Aunt Lotus, am I too heavy? I swallowed the sharp, bitter lump in my throat. I knelt in the dirt, wrapping my arms around her small, fragile frame. The contrast between this neglected child and her mother's glittering online life was sickening. I pulled her close, resting my chin on her soft hair. You are not heavy, sweet girl, I whispered fiercely. You are my entire world. I closed my eyes tightly. The storm was coming soon. Nathan always took his lunch breaks with me. We usually sat on the lowered tailgate of his battered pickup truck sharing stale sandwiches while the heavy machinery roared in the background. To anyone else, Nathan was just another guy hauling concrete. He wore faded flannel shirts, scuffed steel-toed boots, and a yellow reflective vest covered in plaster stains. But there was always a quiet intensity in his dark eyes, a sharp intelligence that didn't match the dirt on his hands. They actually deleted the email, I said, staring blankly at a crumpled blueprint in my hands. 6 months of interviews, late nights studying the European structural codes. James just logged in and sent a polite refusal because Oriana needed a bigger closet. Nathan took a slow bite of his sandwich. He didn't look at me with pity. Pity was cheap. He looked at me with a cold, calculating precision. And you are just going to let them take your room? He asked, his voice low and steady over the noise of a passing cement mixer. I don't care about the room, Nathan. I care about the control. They think they own my future. They only own what you allow them to hold, he replied simply. Before I could ask him what he meant, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled slowly onto the dirt path of the construction site. It looked entirely out of place among the bulldozers and excavators. The tinted window rolled down, and a man in a sharp, tailored suit stepped out. He looked frantic, scanning the dusty area, until his eyes landed on our pickup truck. The suited man hurried over, clutching a leather portfolio. He stopped a few feet away from us, looking directly at Nathan. He opened his mouth, and I saw him slightly bow his head. Sir, the board is asking about the acquisition of Nathan didn't speak. He just raised one grease-stained finger. A subtle, sharp gesture. The man in the suit froze mid-sentence. The color drained from his face. He looked at me then, back at Nathan's faded flannel shirt, realizing his mistake. I apologize, the man stammered quickly. I have the wrong site. He practically ran back to the luxury car, the tires kicking up dust as he sped away. I turned to Nathan, my brow furrowed in confusion. Who was that? Nathan calmly wiped his hands on a rag, not missing a beat. Just a guy who is very lost, he said, offering me a slight enigmatic smile. Don't worry about it. We have bigger things to focus on right now. I let it go, returning my attention to the blueprint. But the image of that suited man bowing to a supposedly lowly laborer stayed burned in my mind. Nathan wasn't just laying concrete. He was watching. He was calculating. They all thought he was a nobody. They were entirely wrong. But his secret meant nothing yet. My trap was already set. To understand why James and Flora felt so comfortable destroying my future, you have to understand how they built my past. The dynamic in our household was established early cast in concrete, long before I was old enough to recognize it was a prison. Oriana was the fragile glass ornament. I was the sturdy wooden shelf built solely to display her. I remember the science fair when I was 12. I had spent 3 weeks building a working model of a suspension bridge. I was so proud of the intricate tension wires. When I brought it to the kitchen table to show them, James barely glanced up from his newspaper. That is nice, Lotus. Keep your voice down. Oriana had a terrible day at school and needs absolute silence. My sister had broken a fingernail during recess. She was upstairs, loudly weeping while Flora brought her warm milk. Then came my high school graduation. I had earned a full academic scholarship to the state engineering program. I ran into the living room holding the acceptance letter. Flora looked at it, her expression flat. A scholarship, good, because we need to buy Oriana a new car. She failed her driving test again and feels completely devastated. She needs a convertible to boost her morale. They spent $80,000 on a sports car for a girl without a license, while I packed my bags into a cardboard box and took the bus to my dorm. The final lesson came during my sophomore year of college. I had the flu, burning with a fever, and called home just wanting to hear a comforting voice. James answered, "Lotus, we are busy. Oriana is hosting a party and the catering is late. You are tough. Just take a pill and sleep it off." Click. The dial tone echoed in my ear. I learned a very dangerous lesson that day. I learned that being independent was a curse, because I never demanded anything they assumed I needed nothing. They weaponized my resilience. They labeled me the easy child, so they could completely absolve themselves of the responsibility of parenting me. They poured every ounce of their affection, money, and attention into the bottomless pit of Oriana's vanity. I stopped crying after that phone call. I realized that tears were a currency they only accepted from one daughter. So I became quiet. I became efficient. I focused entirely on my blueprints, my calculations, and my career. I built a fortress around my emotions, laying brick by brick, ensuring they could never reach me again. They mistook my silence for submission. They assumed that because I did not fight back, I had simply surrendered to being the background character in Oriana's glamorous life. They thought I would blindly accept the erasure of my European dream just to give her more closet space. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I was an engineer. I understood structural integrity. I knew exactly where to apply pressure. The foundation was already cracking. I stood in the narrow hallway, the acrid, chalky smell of pulverized drywall burning the back of my throat. Two hired contractors were aggressively swinging heavy sledgehammers into the wall that used to separate my modest bedroom from the guest suite. Flora stood a few feet away, safely out of the dust zone. She was leisurely sipping a glass of iced lemon water, casually pointing a manicured finger to show the workers exactly where she wanted Oriana's new custom shoe racks installed. My heavy oak drafting table, the one I had spent hundreds of lonely, exhausted hours huddled over preparing for the Munich engineering exams, was shoved carelessly out into the corridor. My expensive textbooks, meticulously drawn blueprints, and hard-earned technical certificates were dumped in a messy, disorganized pile on the worn-out living room sofa. James stood nearby with his hands on his hips, admiring the newly expanded void. He didn't see a daughter losing her only private sanctuary. He saw valuable square footage being successfully reclaimed for a much better, more glamorous purpose. It is a deeply terrifying realization when you finally understand that your family views you not as a living, breathing human being, but merely as a piece of inconvenient furniture. They were literally erasing my physical existence from the blueprint of the house. I watched the white plaster crumble and fall to the hardwood floor in thick, heavy clouds. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my hard hat at the wall or drop to my knees and beg them to stop. People always wonder why victims of highly toxic families stay quiet for so long. Experts call it the cruel trap of normalization. When emotional deprivation and blatant disrespect become your daily routine, you eventually stop reacting to the initial sting. You learn to instinctively shrink your own needs to completely avoid the impact of their narcissism. You convince yourself that if you just ask for less, they will eventually love you more. But as I stood there watching a thick layer of construction dust settle permanently over the rejection email, still glowing faintly on my laptop screen, something inside my chest finally snapped shut. The heavy steel door of my empathy closed forever. The normalization trap completely lost its hold on my mind. Flora glanced over her shoulder, offering me a tight, fake smile, expecting me to quietly clean up the mess they had made. They genuinely thought they were merely taking away my physical space. They had no idea they were just finalizing the terms of their own impending eviction. I turned away the crunch of broken plaster loud under my heavy steel-toed boots. The hammer swung down again. To truly understand the flawless legal trap I had set, you have to rewind exactly 3 years. The financial foundation of this pristine household almost collapsed entirely under the crushing weight of Oriana's endless vanity. She had recklessly racked up an $80,000 debt from a severe online gambling habit which she successfully disguised to her loyal followers as a high-end lifestyle investment. The private creditors were absolutely ruthless. They threatened to place immediate public liens on the beloved Cape Cod property. James and Flora were in a state of absolute frantic panic. Facing imminent bank foreclosure and the ultimate humiliating destruction of their carefully curated public image, they suddenly remembered my existence. They came to my room, begging, weeping, genuine tears, and frantically promising that things would change forever if I just used my hard-earned savings to bail them out. I agreed to pay the massive debt, but I didn't do it blindly. I had already learned that their tears dried the exact second the check cleared. I requested a private meeting with a man they didn't know, and I brought a thick stack of formal legal papers to the kitchen table that evening. I politely told James and Flora it was a standard financial guarantor form required by the bank to officially release my funds. They were so incredibly desperate, so frantic to save their golden child from a public scandal, that they didn't even bother to read the bold capitalized print at the very top of the first page. It was a quitclaim deed in escrow. By eagerly signing those papers, they legally transferred the entire property rights of the house directly to me, strictly contingent upon their failure to repay the $80,000 within 36 months. They quickly scribbled their signatures across the dotted lines without a single second thought. They assumed I was too foolishly loyal, too desperate for their basic approval to ever actually hold them accountable. They never paid a single cent back. As the months passed, they simply went back to their grand delusions, completely ignoring the massive financial sacrifice I had made. They went back to buying designer bags and planning lavish parties, fully believing they had successfully outsmarted the system. They had no idea that the luxury house they were currently renovating, the very walls they were tearing down for Oriana's closet, was legally mine. They signed their own ruin. The morning after my bedroom wall was so casually demolished, I sat in a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop in downtown Houston. The rich, comforting scent of roasted espresso beans was a deeply welcome change from the suffocating, chalky concrete dust of my former room. Across the small wooden table sat Arthur. He was a retired real estate attorney with sharp silver hair, remarkably kind eyes, and a very quiet, methodical demeanor. He was the brilliant legal mind who had carefully drafted the quitclaim deed 3 years ago. Without a single word, Arthur slowly reached into his battered leather briefcase and slid a thick, heavy manila envelope across the polished table. Inside was the original, fully notarized document, complete with the heavy raised stamp of the county clerk. The 36-month grace period officially expired last Tuesday at midnight, Lotus Arthur said, softly taking a slow, measured sip of his black coffee. The deed is fully executable. You own the property outright. There are no hidden loopholes, no margins for error. It is ironclad. I pulled the heavy paper from the envelope, tracing my calloused fingers over the official golden seal. Flora and James were completely oblivious to the legal reality of their living situation. Arthur looked at me, his sharp expression softening into a look of quiet paternal pride. He knew exactly what this family had put me through. You owe them absolutely nothing, Lotus Arthur stated, his voice firm and unwavering. Blood does not give anyone the infinite right to drain your life force. You have carried their financial and emotional burdens for far too long. It is time to let them carry their own weight. His words were a quiet balm, a necessary dose of healing truth I desperately needed to hear. In a world where my own father had deleted my future to build a closet, Arthur was the only father figure I had ever truly known. He didn't ask me to be the bigger person. He didn't ask me to forgive the unforgivable. He just handed me the legal sword I needed to cut the toxic ties forever. I carefully folded the heavy document, slid the envelope securely into my leather work bag, and finished my coffee in silence. The trap was officially armed. Losing the incredible Munich opportunity did not break my stride. It only sharpened my internal focus to a dangerous, razor-thin edge. If I was going to be aggressively forced to stay in Houston, I was going to completely dominate my reality here. I voluntarily took on double shifts at the structural engineering firm. I actively requested the most grueling field inspections, standing on the skeletal steel frames of towering high-rises while the aggressive Texas heat pushed well over 100 degrees. My bank accounts grew in absolute invisible silence. I immediately redirected all my direct deposits to a highly private, secure offshore account Arthur had helped me set up years ago. Flora and James mistakenly assumed my new quiet demeanor meant I was deeply depressed and permanently defeated. They continued to proudly demand that I pay the monthly utility bills and property taxes, which I did strictly to maintain the perfect illusion of my blind compliance. At night, While I sat quietly in the cramped, dark corner of the living room, soaking my blistered, heavily calloused hands in warm Epsom salts, Oriana would lounge luxuriously on the opposite velvet sofa. She would spend hours admiring her freshly manicured, diamond-encrusted nails. She would loudly complain to Flora about how physically exhausting it was to stand under ring lights and unbox free promotional items for her internet channel. She claimed her life was overwhelmingly stressful. I never argued with her. I never raised my voice to point out the blatant hypocrisy. I just watched her methodically calculating the exact mathematical moment the financial floor would permanently drop out from under her perfectly styled feet. Every time Flora praised Oriana's fake digital empire, I mentally reviewed the exact wording of the quitclaim deed. I wasn't just surviving their abuse anymore. I was actively curating their downfall. I was cutting the heavy financial cord one invisible silent thread at a time. They thought I was their loyal servant. I was actually their landlord. My silence was my weapon. The fragile, heavily manufactured peace I had maintained shattered completely on a warm Thursday evening. I walked through the heavy oak front door, utterly exhausted from a brutal 12-hour shift at the construction site, and nearly tripped over a small, cracked plastic suitcase sitting entirely alone near the porch. Inside the house, Flora was aggressively pacing the hallway, rubbing her temples with dramatic flair. "She cries entirely too much," Flora complained, loudly glaring with deep annoyance toward the living room. "Oriana desperately needs her absolute beauty sleep for a major brand photo shoot tomorrow morning. The kid is completely ruining the pristine aesthetic of this house. We are looking into that cheap, year-round boarding school upstate. She needs to go." I froze, the blood running instantly cold in my tired veins. I looked past Flora's perfectly styled hair and saw Lily. The tiny 5-year-old was sitting quietly on the bare hardwood floor, desperately clutching a faded stuffed bear with a torn ear. Her face was incredibly pale, and silent tears were streaming steadily down her dirt-smudged cheeks. They had heartlessly packed her meager belongings into that broken, discarded suitcase. They were actively treating a living, breathing human child like a defective, inconvenient accessory that could simply be shipped away when she stopped looking cute for the cameras. A cold, absolute fury settled deep in the dead center of my chest, unlike anything I had ever felt before in my entire life. I walked right past Flora, completely ignoring her continued selfish rambling. I knelt down gently on the cold floor and carefully lifted Lily into my arms. She immediately buried her small, wet face into my dusty work shirt, her tiny fingers gripping the heavy safety fabric like an absolute lifeline. I stood up slowly, holding her tightly against my chest, feeling her tiny heartbeat racing against mine. This was the final, unbreakable red line. They could steal my money. They could aggressively destroy my bedroom. They could even try to erase my career. But absolutely nobody was going to touch Lily. The real war had begun. The immediate aftermath of taking Lily out of that hostile hallway was not a fiery confrontation. It was a profound, calculated silence. I knew that engaging in a screaming match with James and Flora would only give them the dramatic ammunition they desperately craved. Instead, I channeled every single ounce of my burning anger into raw, unrelenting physical momentum. If they were going to systematically trap me in Houston, I was going to quietly build an absolute fortress right beneath their feet. I began voluntarily taking on the most grueling, demanding shifts at the engineering firm. While the suffocating Texas summer heat regularly pushed past 100 degrees, I was hundreds of feet in the air inspecting heavy steel girders and securing load-bearing concrete pillars. The physical exhaustion was incredibly intense, but it was deeply therapeutic. The harsh, burning ache in my muscles successfully drowned out the lingering, toxic echoes of my mother's constant complaints and my sister's manufactured drama. I became a highly efficient silent machine. I was earning an incredibly lucrative hazard pay for the dangerous overtime hours, but I made absolutely certain that not a single extra dollar ever touched my primary checking account. Following the strict, methodical advice of attorney Arthur, my excess earnings were immediately funneled into an offshore, completely unlisted trust fund. I was quietly securing a financial future for Lily, ensuring that Oriana could never aggressively weaponize her own child for financial gain again. James and Flora misread my profound silence entirely. They assumed my quiet demeanor meant I had been successfully broken. They truly believed that by deleting my European dream, they had completely stripped away my will to resist. Every Friday, James would confidently leave the utility bills and property tax notices on the kitchen counter, fully expecting me to pay them without a single word of protest. I paid them methodically, strictly to maintain the flawless illusion of my ultimate submission. I would sit quietly at the kitchen island, meticulously transferring funds to keep their lights on, while Oriana complained loudly about the exhausting burden of picking a color palette for her upcoming online brand launch. They thought my calloused, blistered hands were permanently chained to their endless, shallow desires. They didn't realize that my hands were simply pulling the legal ropes tighter around their necks. I was building our escape. The most profound healing rarely happens in pristine, quiet therapy rooms. For Lily, healing happened in the loud, dusty, chaotic environment of a commercial construction site. After the horrific incident with the suitcase, I absolutely refused to leave her alone in that toxic mansion. I arranged for a secure, highly vetted after-school program and on the weekends. The site foreman kindly allowed her to sit safely behind the heavy chain-link perimeter while I finished my technical inspections. In the beginning, Lily was overwhelmingly terrified. The deep psychological trauma of living with Oriana had conditioned her to constantly apologize for her mere existence. If a heavy wrench dropped, she would instantly flinch and cover her head. If she accidentally spilled a drop of her juice box, she would frantically start crying, terrified that she had ruined a precious aesthetic. But the burly, grease-stained men on my crew didn't yell at her. They didn't tell her she was a burden. Instead, they brought her extra snacks. One of the heavy machinery operators spent his entire lunch break carving a tiny wooden bulldozer for her. Nathan surprised her one Tuesday afternoon with a miniature bright yellow safety hard hat and a tiny leather tool belt. When I climbed down from the scaffolding at sunset, I found her sitting happily on her favorite empty paint bucket, carefully drawing structural lines on the back of my discarded blueprints. "Look, Aunt Lotus," Lily said brightly, holding up a remarkably straight sketch of a building frame. Nathan said, "I have an excellent eye for structural integrity." I wiped a streak of dark grease from my forehead, feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion wash over me. The stark, undeniable contrast between this dusty reality and the mansion was staggering. A noisy construction site, completely surrounded by rough, hardworking strangers, was infinitely safer for this little girl than a luxurious, air-conditioned house filled with her own blood relatives. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was actively learning that she had inherent value. She was learning that love wasn't something you had to aggressively beg for by making yourself invisible. She placed her small, dusty hand in mine as we walked toward the truck. "Do we have to go back to the loud house?" she asked softly. "Not for much longer," I promised. We were healing in the dust. It was incredibly late on a Thursday evening when the ultimate decision was finally solidified. The construction site was completely deserted, bathed only in the harsh, artificial glow of the tall security floodlights. Nathan and I were leaning over the dented hood of his pickup truck, quietly studying a complex structural blueprint of a failing commercial overpass. The quiet intimacy between us wasn't built on dramatic, sweeping romance. It was built on a foundation of absolute mutual respect and shared endurance. "The microfractures in the primary support columns are completely critical," I murmured, tracing a pencil line over the schematic. They focused entirely on the expensive decorative facade and completely ignored the actual load-bearing integrity. "The whole thing is incredibly unstable." Nathan didn't look at the blueprint. His dark, intelligent eyes were completely focused on my face. "You are not talking about the overpass anymore, are you, Lotus?" I stopped tracing the line. The heavy, suffocating weight of the impending confrontation settled deeply into my chest. He was absolutely right. I was talking about my family. I was talking about the quitclaim deed that was sitting securely in Arthur's vault, waiting like a loaded weapon. I confessed to Nathan that I was mentally ready to pull the trigger to legally evict my own parents, but the lingering, deeply conditioned guilt of being the good daughter was still slightly paralyzing my hands. Nathan reached out his rough, calloused fingers, gently covering mine. He didn't offer me a soft, comforting platitude. He didn't tell me to simply forgive them and move on. He spoke with the absolute, unyielding clarity of a man who understood how power truly operated in the real world. "A rotting foundation cannot be repaired, Lotus," Nathan said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding resonance. "You cannot fix a structure that is fundamentally designed to crush you. It can only be demolished. You have the blueprints. You have the legal authority. Stop apologizing for surviving their destruction." His words instantly shattered the last remaining chain of my toxic childhood conditioning. He wasn't just holding my hand. He was aggressively handing me the absolute permission to finally save myself. I looked deeply into his eyes, feeling the terrifying, liberating surge of true autonomy. I nodded once. Oriana lit the match herself. The illusion of peace aggressively shattered the very next afternoon. When I pushed open the heavy front door, the overpowering, suffocating scent of extremely expensive imported lilies immediately assaulted my senses. The living room had been completely transformed. Massive, ridiculous floral arrangements covered every available surface. Oriana was standing in the center of the room wearing a highly impractical sequin dress, loudly celebrating into her smartphone camera. James and Flora were hovering nearby, looking incredibly proud and frantic all at once. As soon as I took off my work boots, James aggressively waved a thick stack of formal financial documents in my direction. "Lotus, sit down right now," James ordered, his tone dripping with absolute entitled authority. "Oriana just officially secured the venue for her engagement party. It is an incredibly exclusive VIP-only country club. They demand a $50,000 deposit by tomorrow morning." I remained perfectly still. I didn't sit down. I simply stared at the aggressively pre-filled loan application he slid across the pristine marble island. My name was already printed on the guarantor line. "You need to sign this immediately," Flora chimed in, her voice entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. "It is for your sister's brand. She is marrying a prominent influencer. The networking opportunities are completely vital for the family's future. You have a steady engineering income, so the bank will easily approve your signature." They weren't asking. They were actively demanding that I chain myself to another half-decade of grueling debt solely so Oriana could throw a fabricated party for strangers on the internet. I looked at the pen James forcefully pushed toward me. I calmly picked it up. Flora smiled, assuming my ultimate compliance was permanently guaranteed. Instead of signing, I methodically picked up the heavy loan application. With slow, incredibly deliberate movements, I tore the thick stack of papers neatly in half. The sharp, tearing sound echoed violently in the quiet kitchen. Then I tore the pieces into quarters. I let the shredded, useless paper flutter down onto the expensive marble counter. "No," I said quietly. James turned a violent shade of purple. Flora gasped in absolute horror. Oriana actually dropped her phone. They immediately erupted into an aggressive symphony of toxic insults, calling me a jealous, miserable failure. I didn't raise my voice to defend myself. I just turned my back and walked straight out the door. The illusion was finally breaking. By Saturday morning, Oriana's manufactured rage had completely mutated into an aggressive, highly publicized digital smear campaign. I sat quietly at the kitchen island drinking black coffee while she furiously paced the living room live streaming to her thousands of followers. She was masterfully playing the ultimate victim, dramatically wiping fake tears away as she loudly lamented about her deeply jealous, violently unsupportive sister who was aggressively trying to ruin her magical engagement. But a true narcissist can never sustain the victim narrative for long before their massive ego aggressively demands the spotlight. Within minutes, her tone completely shifted from pathetic weeping to arrogant, unhinged bragging. "I don't even need her pathetic little paycheck," Oriana announced loudly to her phone, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "My management team is currently in advanced talks with a major anonymous infrastructure billionaire. He has been actively viewing my profile all month. Once he fully sponsors my lifestyle, I am going to buy a mansion 10 times the size of this place." Right at that exact moment, the front doorbell rang. I stood up and opened the heavy door. Nathan was standing there on the porch, waiting to pick Lily and me up for a weekend trip to the park. He was wearing his usual faded flannel shirt and heavily scuffed, concrete-stained work boots. Oriana instantly spun around, aggressively pointing her glowing camera lens directly at him. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that dripped with pure, unfiltered venom. "Oh, look, everybody," Oriana sneered, her voice echoing shrilly in the hallway. "The glorious construction trash has finally arrived. This is exactly why my sister is so completely miserable. She is permanently destined for the absolute gutter with this pathetic, dirt-poor laborer. Nathan did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to defend his honor. He simply looked at Oriana's glowing phone screen and then directly into her wildly arrogant eyes. A slow, incredibly calm, and utterly chilling smile spread across his face. He politely tipped the brim of his dusty hard hat in her direction. He knew exactly what she didn't. Her anonymous infrastructure billionaire was standing right in her hallway wearing work boots. If you can't wait to see the look on her face when she realizes who Nathan truly is, hit that like button. She was mocking her own executioner. The very next morning, I sat across from Arthur in his deeply quiet, wood-paneled office. The contrast between this solemn, highly organized space and the chaotic, fake luxury of James and Flora's house was incredibly stark. Nathan sat beside me, his large, calloused hands resting calmly on his knees. Arthur adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and carefully laid the thick, original copy of the quitclaim deed flat on the mahogany desk between us. The fundamental beauty of a properly executed quitclaim deed in escrow is its absolute clinical detachment from human emotion. Arthur explained, his voice smooth and methodical. The law does not care about your mother's tears or your father's empty threats. 3 years ago, when they signed this document, they legally agreed to transfer the entire property to you if they failed to repay the $80,000. They willingly placed the deed in escrow, meaning a neutral third party held it until the specific conditions were met or violated. He paused, tapping a silver pen against the heavy parchment. They completely failed to meet those financial conditions. Therefore, the escrow agent has legally released the deed to you. As of this exact moment, you are the sole undisputed owner of the property. James and Flora have absolutely zero legal standing. They are officially tenants in a house they do not own. I stared down at the crisp black ink, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of vindication. People often believe that justice requires screaming matches, dramatic confrontations, or miraculous interventions from a wealthy savior. But true justice is deeply quiet. True justice is a meticulously documented process. I had not relied on a sudden lottery win or a long-lost inheritance. I had relied entirely on my own foresight. I had learned very early in life that my parents would endlessly drain me if I didn't aggressively build a concrete wall around my resources. My kindness 3 years ago was not blind, pathetic submission. It was a highly calculated investment in my ultimate freedom. I had patiently collected every single receipt, documented every missed payment, and quietly allowed them to dig their own financial grave. They are going to try and manipulate you, Arthur warned softly, looking directly into my eyes. They will absolutely weaponize guilt. They will call you ungrateful. They will scream about family loyalty. They can scream all they want, I replied, my voice steady and perfectly calm. Screaming does not rewrite a notarized contract. Arthur smiled a deep, genuine expression of pride. He slid a second folder across the desk. It contained the official eviction notices already drafted and stamped. I picked up the pen. When we left Arthur's office, Nathan did not drive us back to the dusty, noisy construction site. Instead, he steered his battered pickup truck toward the towering glass-fronted financial district in the absolute center of downtown Houston. We pulled into an exclusive, highly secured underground parking garage. The valet, dressed in a sharp uniform, didn't even blink at Nathan's faded flannel shirt or his concrete-stained boots. He simply rushed forward, respectfully opening the door with a slight bow. Nathan led me into a private biometric elevator that shot us up to the 40th floor. The heavy steel doors slid open to reveal a massive, breathtaking corporate office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, commanding view of the entire city. Elegant, silent assistants moved purposefully across the plush carpets. Every single person we passed immediately stopped and offered a deeply respectful nod to the man walking beside me. Nathan guided me into a massive corner office and quietly closed the heavy oak door behind us. He walked over to the sprawling mahogany desk, opened a secure drawer, and pulled out a thick black leather portfolio. I told you, a rotting foundation can only be demolished, Nathan said calmly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. You have the blueprints for the house. Now let me show you the blueprints for the rest of their fake empire. He opened the portfolio and laid a series of complex financial documents in front of me. I scanned the top pages, my eyes widening slightly as the massive numbers registered in my brain. It was a comprehensive portfolio of high-risk corporate debt. Oriana's cosmetic company has been functionally bankrupt for over 8 months, Nathan explained, tracing a finger over a massive column of negative red numbers. She took out aggressive high-interest loans from private equity firms to maintain her luxurious online lifestyle. 6 months ago, my infrastructure fund quietly bought up all of her toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. I looked up at him, my heart pounding with a profound, terrifying awe. "You own her debt," I whispered. "I own the entire company," Nathan corrected smoothly. "I have the legal authority to instantly liquidate every single asset she claims to possess. Her brand, her inventory, her bank accounts. All of it." He wasn't just a laborer. He was the invisible architect of her total financial ruin. We stood there in the quiet luxury of his office, two highly calculated minds, seamlessly merging our power. I had the legal sword to take their home. He had the financial heavy artillery to crush their illusions. On Friday evening, we walked into the Cape Cod mansion for the very last time. We arrived at the house precisely at 7 o'clock. The evening air was thick and humid, but inside the mansion, the aggressive air conditioning was running at full blast. The moment I pushed open the heavy front door, I instantly saw my 2 medium-sized suitcases sitting carelessly on the porch, my clothes haphazardly stuffed inside. They hadn't even bothered to zip them properly. From the formal dining room, the loud, obnoxious sounds of clinking crystal glasses and arrogant laughter echoed down the hallway. I walked calmly toward the noise, my heavy steel-toed boots making zero sound on the plush imported runner rugs. Nathan followed closely right behind me, his presence, a solid, immovable mountain of silent strength. James, Flora, and Oriana were sitting around the massive dining table, surrounded by half-empty bottles of incredibly expensive wine. Oriana was busy examining her diamond engagement ring under the bright chandelier light, while James loudly recounted a fabricated story about a highly successful golf game. When Flora finally noticed me standing quietly in the doorway, she let out an exasperated, deeply annoyed sigh. Finally, Flora snapped, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "We packed your cheap clothes for you. Since you are so selfishly determined to ruin your sister's happiness by refusing to sign that simple loan, you can no longer live under our very generous roof. You are officially kicked out." James didn't even look at me. He just took a slow sip of his wine. "Leave your house keys and your primary credit card on the counter before you go, Lotus. Consider the card a small necessary payment for the massive disrespect you have shown this family." They were so incredibly confident. They sat there in their designer clothes, fully believing they held the ultimate absolute power. They thought tossing my suitcases out was the final devastating punishment that would force me to fall to my knees and beg for their toxic mercy. They genuinely believed I was the weak, compliant little girl who would simply vanish into the night, leaving my bank accounts completely open for them to drain. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask them why they hated me so much. I just stood perfectly still, looking at them the way a structural engineer looks at a building right before the demolition charges are aggressively detonated. Would you have given them 24 hours to pack, or kicked them out immediately? Let me know in the comments below. I slowly reached into my leather work bag. I pulled a crisp blue medical-style folder from my bag and dropped it flat onto the center of the dining table. It landed right next to James's expensive wine glass with a heavy, definitive thud. The sudden noise made Oriana jump, her perfectly styled face twisting into an ugly scowl. "What is this garbage?" James growled, visibly irritated that I hadn't immediately run out the door in tears. "That," I said, my voice completely cold and unnervingly calm, "is a highly detailed cybersecurity report. It contains the exact unalterable digital timestamps and the specific residential IP addresses that were aggressively used to access my private password-protected laptop." Flora's hand froze entirely, her wine glass suspended awkwardly in midair. The color instantly drained from her heavily powdered cheeks. "It officially confirms I continued speaking at an even, methodical pace that last Tuesday, someone in this specific household committed a serious federal offense. You illegally breached my private network, intercepted a highly sensitive corporate email from Munich, and fraudulently impersonated me to decline a major career opportunity." "You are being completely hysterical," James stammered, though a sudden bead of nervous sweat broke out on his forehead. "We are your parents. We have the absolute right to monitor what you do under our roof." "You do not have the right to commit federal wire fraud," I corrected him sharply, my tone absolutely devoid of any emotion. And you certainly do not have the right to steal my entire future simply because you needed more square footage for a closet. I leaned forward slightly, resting my calloused hands flat on the polished table. I have already sent copies of those complete digital logs to my attorney and to the Regional Cybercrimes Division. If you ever attempt to access my private accounts, contact my employers, or digitally harass me again, I will not hesitate to press full criminal charges. Flora completely dropped her glass. It shattered violently against the hardwood floor, sending dark red wine spilling across the pristine wood like blood. She stared at me, her eyes wide with absolute naked terror. For the very first time in 27 years, she wasn't looking at a compliant, invisible servant. She was looking at an incredibly dangerous adversary who had completely outsmarted her. But I wasn't finished. I stepped back, calmly clearing the way for the man standing right beside me. Oriana, desperately trying to regain control of the rapidly collapsing room, stood up abruptly and pointed an aggressively manicured finger at Nathan. "Get this filthy construction trash out of our dining room immediately," she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged frequency. "You think you can just walk in here with your pathetic dirt-poor boyfriend and threaten us? My new investor is going to personally destroy both of you." Nathan did not blink. He stepped forward slowly, moving with the quiet, overwhelming authority of an apex predator. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached into the front pocket of his faded flannel shirt and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. He tossed it casually onto the table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood, stopping right in front of Oriana. "Pick it up," Nathan commanded. His voice was incredibly soft, yet it carried a terrifying weight that made the entire room completely silent. Oriana frowned, aggressively snatched the card off the table, and glanced down. Her arrogant smirk instantly vanished. Her jaw dropped open in absolute, complete shock. "Julian," she whispered, her voice violently trembling as she read his real name. "Julian, CEO of Vanguard Infrastructure." "Yes," Nathan Julian replied coldly. "I am the anonymous investor you have been desperately begging for attention online for the last month, but I am not here to sponsor your wedding." He reached into his back pocket and dropped a heavy folded legal document right on top of his business card. "That is a formal notice of immediate asset liquidation," Julian stated with clinical precision. "6 months ago, my firm legally purchased the entire portfolio of your toxic corporate debt. Your cosmetic brand is functionally dead. As of 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, we are aggressively seizing your inventory, freezing your business accounts, and filing a public lien against all your heavily branded assets to recover the massive capital you squandered." Oriana's legs literally gave out. She collapsed backward into her expensive dining chair, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the legal notice. The glamorous, highly curated influencer world she had built on a foundation of massive lies had just been completely, brutally obliterated by the very man she had mocked as a lowly laborer. James and Flora stared at Julian in sheer paralyzing horror. The billionaire they had desperately wanted to court was standing right in their house, firmly holding my hand. And then I played my final card. James finally snapped. The sheer overwhelming reality of Julian's true identity and the total destruction of Oriana's fake empire completely shattered his carefully constructed facade of control. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. He slammed his heavy fists down onto the expensive dining table, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently against each other. "Get out!" James roared, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively. "Both of you get out of my house right this second. I do not care how much money you have, you arrogant punk. This is my property, and I will not allow you to stand in my dining room and threaten my family. Lotus, grab your bags and get off my porch." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply opened the blue medical folder once again and slowly pulled out the heavy notarized quitclaim deed. I placed it perfectly flat on the center of the table, directly in front of my raging father. "You are gravely mistaken," I said. My voice was incredibly quiet, yet it easily cut through his loud, frantic screaming. "This is not your house." James stopped yelling. He looked down at the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the bold legal print and the heavy golden seal of the county clerk. Flora leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching audibly in the suffocating silence of the room. "3 years ago, you signed this document in exchange for $80,000 to save Oriana from her own massive debts," I explained with clinical, unyielding precision. "The strict legal terms clearly stated that if you failed to repay the funds within 36 months, The absolute ownership of this entire property would automatically transfer to me. That deadline expired on Tuesday at midnight. The escrow agent has fully released the deed. I looked directly into James's terrified eyes. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift, it completely inverted. He was no longer the imposing patriarch demanding my absolute submission. He was a deeply indebted tenant facing imminent eviction. "I am the sole legal owner of this estate," I stated calmly. "You are currently trespassing on my private property. Because I am far more generous than you have ever been, I am giving you exactly 24 hours to pack your belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still here tomorrow evening, I will have the local authorities formally remove you. Would you have given them 24 hours or kicked them out immediately? Let me know in the comments." The absolute silence was deafening. The house was mine. The immediate reaction to a total loss of power is rarely graceful. For James and Flora, it was a deeply pathetic, horrifying display of pure desperation. The aggressive arrogance that had defined their entire parenting strategy completely evaporated, leaving behind two terrified, hollow people who suddenly realized they had absolutely nothing left to leverage. Flora was the first to break. The heavy crystal wine glass she had been holding slipped entirely from her trembling fingers, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces across the hardwood floor. She let out a loud theatrical sob and practically threw herself across the dining table toward me. "Lotus, please," Flora wailed, her voice cracking in a desperate, highly manufactured display of maternal grief. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head. You cannot simply throw your own family out onto the street. We made a mistake with the email. We admit it, but family always forgives." She reached out her heavily jeweled hands, frantically grabbing the sleeve of my dusty work shirt. I looked down at her clutching fingers. For 27 years, I had desperately craved her affectionate touch. Now it just felt incredibly heavy, suffocating, and entirely transactional. I gently but very firmly peeled her manicured fingers off my arm and took a deliberate step back. "You did not put a roof over my head," I corrected her quietly. "I bought this roof to save you, and you repaid me by aggressively attempting to destroy my career. You do not love me, Mother. You only love the financial convenience and the silent obedience that I provided." James tried a different tactic. He attempted to bargain, his voice dropping into a sleazy, desperate negotiation tone. "Lotus, honey, let us be reasonable adults about this. We can pay you rent. We can draft a formal lease agreement. Julian here understands business. We can make this highly profitable for everyone." Julian let out a short, cold, dry laugh. He crossed his arms over his chest, his dark eyes radiating absolute disgust. "I do not do business with parasites," Julian said softly. I looked at the three of them one last time. They were completely trapped in the agonizing wreckage of their own profound selfishness. I felt no lingering guilt. The heavy, suffocating chains of my childhood conditioning had completely rusted and fallen away. 24 hours, I repeated simply. I turned and walked away. A cornered narcissist will always attempt a desperate, wildly unpredictable final strike. I fully expected Oriana to retaliate, and I was completely prepared for the exact angle she would choose. Early the very next morning, my phone began vibrating endlessly with frantic notifications. Oriana had gone live on her primary social media channels. She was sitting in her dim bedroom performing an absolutely masterful display of hysterical weeping. She loudly accused me to her massive digital audience of being a violent, deeply unstable sister who had maliciously manipulated our elderly parents out of their beloved home. Within minutes, a cheap, sleazy local attorney hired by James formally emailed me a highly aggressive cease and desist letter. The letter blatantly threatened to file an emergency injunction to permanently strip me of my temporary guardianship over Lily, citing my unstable emotional state. It was a textbook false counterattack. They thought the terrifying threat of losing Lily and facing a massive public digital cancellation would instantly force me to surrender the house and back down. They wanted me to panic. I did not panic. I calmly opened my laptop. I did not write a long emotional defense. I simply uploaded 2 specific, irrefutable files to a public, highly visible legal blog. The first file was the complete certified digital server log proving James had illegally breached my computer to reject my corporate job offer. The second was the heart-wrenching high-definition security camera footage from the construction site, clearly showing Oriana completely ignoring Lily as the child wandered near a dangerous, active heavy machinery zone, while her mother filmed a makeup tutorial in her parked luxury car. I forwarded the exact same files to the local family court and the local police department. The digital fallout was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly catastrophic. Oriana's major corporate sponsors immediately severed all remaining ties, publicly condemning her horrific child neglect. Her followers turned on her in a massive, unyielding wave of absolute disgust. The cheap lawyer representing my parents immediately formally withdrew from the case to avoid being implicated in their wire fraud. Their pathetic, desperate counterattack did not even last a full 6 hours. By noon, the manufactured digital outrage had completely imploded, burying them under the crushing weight of their own documented lies. The truth crushed them entirely. I did not stay at the Cape Cod mansion to personally watch them pack their expensive designer luggage. I had zero desire to witness their final pathetic weeping or listen to their hollow, desperate apologies. I spent the entire weekend safely at Julian's quiet, secure apartment, focusing entirely on making sure Lily felt safe, loved, and completely insulated from the toxic fallout of her mother's massive public cancellation. When I formally returned to the property on Monday morning, the massive house was completely empty. The overwhelming, suffocating scent of expensive, imported floral arrangements was gone, replaced by a quiet, slightly dusty stillness. They had completely vacated the premises, leaving behind nothing but scattered luxury shopping bags and a massive pile of unpaid final utility bills. I learned about their ultimate fate through the cold, highly reliable updates provided by attorney Arthur. Without the massive equity of the house to leverage, and with Oriana's corporate cosmetic company ruthlessly liquidated by Julian's financial firm, their fake, heavily curated lifestyle violently evaporated overnight. James and Flora were forced to immediately relocate to a cramped, deeply unremarkable rental apartment on the far industrial outskirts of Houston. Without my heavy structural engineering salary quietly subsidizing their daily existence, James was forced to take a low-level, incredibly demanding retail management job just to keep their basic lights on. Flora, deeply humiliated and completely stripped of her beloved country club status, rarely left the tiny apartment. Oriana's fate was arguably the most severe. Her digital platform was permanently banned due to the overwhelming public backlash regarding the security footage. Saddled with the massive, lingering personal debts from her liquidated brand, she found herself completely unemployable in the glamorous social circles she once proudly dominated. She was forced into obscurity, entirely cut off from the endless public validation she desperately needed to survive. I did not feel any lingering sadness for them. I did not secretly wish for a magical cinematic reconciliation. They were simply experiencing the extremely ordinary, painfully boring reality that the rest of the working world navigated every single day. They had spent decades actively destroying others to comfortably float above the ground. Now they had to walk. The sterile, brightly lit corridors of the downtown family courthouse felt entirely different from the dusty, chaotic environment of my construction sites. It was a space designed strictly for facts, heavily documented evidence, and clinical legal resolution. I sat quietly on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, holding Lily's tiny hand in mine. She was wearing a crisp new dress, her small feet kicking nervously against the polished marble floor. The actual custody hearing was incredibly brief and almost entirely anticlimactic. Oriana did not even bother to show up to defend her maternal rights. She was reportedly too deeply humiliated by her massive public cancellation to face a judge entirely abandoning her daughter without a single backward glance. James and Flora, severely drowning in their new financial reality, had absolutely zero capital to hire another attorney to contest the legal proceedings. Arthur stood calmly beside me at the heavy wooden plaintiff's table. He methodically presented the judge with the thick, undeniable stack of evidence. He submitted the verified security footage of extreme neglect, the formal financial records proving I was the sole consistent provider for the child's basic needs, and the detailed character references from my engineering firm, confirming my stability. The judge, a stern older woman with sharp eyes, reviewed the heavy file in absolute silence. She looked down at Oriana's empty chair, shaking her head in quiet, professional disgust. Then she looked directly at me. She didn't ask me invasive, highly emotional questions. The paperwork spoke entirely for itself. With a heavy, definitive strike, she brought her wooden gavel down onto the polished bench. The loud, sharp sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Full legal and physical custody is immediately granted to the aunt, the judge stated firmly. The biological mother is formally stripped of all primary guardianship rights. I exhaled a long, deeply shaky breath. The heavy, suffocating terror that they might someday legally snatch Lily away from me completely vanished in that exact second. I signed the final binding legal documents with a steady hand. I looked down at the little girl standing quietly beside me, her massive eyes wide with curious wonder. I picked her up tightly. The ink saved us. The massive glass windows of George Bush Intercontinental Airport offered a brilliant, unobstructed view of the clear Texas sky. The aggressive, suffocating humidity of Houston was safely locked outside the heavily air-conditioned terminal. I stood near the international departure gate holding 2 crisp boarding passes and a bright pink passport cover. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the dramatic conclusion in the family courthouse. The heavy dust had finally settled completely, replacing the chaotic noise of my former life with a deeply profound healing silence. I looked down at the small girl standing quietly beside me. Lily was wearing a pristine yellow sundress, her tiny hands firmly gripping the extendable handle of a miniature, brightly colored rolling suitcase. She wasn't carrying a dirty, torn backpack anymore. She wasn't sitting on an empty paint bucket waiting for someone to finally notice her. She was practically vibrating with pure, unfiltered excitement, happily watching the massive commercial airplanes slowly taxi across the sunlit tarmac. "Are we really going to live in a castle, Aunt Lotus?" Lily asked her, huge eyes wide with innocent wonder. "We are going to live in a beautiful house in Munich," I corrected gently, kneeling down to properly adjust the collar of her dress, "and you are going to have your very own room, with walls that nobody will ever knock down." Julian walked up behind us, effortlessly pushing a heavy silver luggage cart loaded with our suitcases. He had finally traded his faded, concrete-stained flannel shirt for a sharp, impeccably tailored dark navy suit, though his quiet, grounding smile remained exactly the same. Julian had not used his massive corporate wealth to artificially buy my career back. He deeply respected my fierce independence far too much to ever insult my capabilities. Instead, he simply utilized his elite cybersecurity team to officially verify the exact IP address breach. He submitted a formal, legally documented explanation to the Munich engineering firm, proving that my initial refusal was entirely fraudulent. The German executives, thoroughly impressed by my original technical exams and deeply sympathetic to the bizarre cybercrime, had immediately reinstated their senior engineering offer. I didn't need a billionaire to rescue my professional dreams. I just needed a loyal ally to help me clear the malicious interference out of my path. "The private car will be waiting for us when we land," Julian said smoothly, handing the ticketing agent our passports. He looked at me, his dark eyes reflecting the brilliant morning sunlight pouring through the massive terminal windows. "Are you absolutely ready to leave this city behind?" I looked over my shoulder one last time. I thought about the heavy steel utility poles, the blistering summer heat, and the luxurious, toxic mansion that had actively tried to consume my entire existence. I thought about James, Flora, and Oriana, completely trapped in their miserable, self-inflicted poverty. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no guilt, just the clean, vast emptiness of a freshly cleared construction site. "I have never been more ready," I replied calmly. We handed over our tickets. The heavy doors opened. The crisp, incredibly cool morning air of Munich was a refreshing shock to the system. It had been 6 months since our flight crossed the Atlantic, entirely leaving the toxic wreckage of my former family thousands of miles behind. I was sitting comfortably on the expansive balcony of our new sunlit apartment, nursing a warm, fragrant cup of dark roast coffee. Inside the spacious living room, the atmosphere was completely serene. Lily was lying flat on a plush, colorful rug, happily using a brand new set of professional drafting pencils to draw intricate, imaginative houses on thick, pristine white paper. She wasn't drawing on the back of my discarded dusty blueprints anymore. She had her own vibrant, dedicated canvas. Julian sat at the heavy oak dining table, quietly reviewing a complex portfolio of international infrastructure investments. He looked up, catching my eye through the open glass doors, and offered a soft, deeply reassuring smile. There was no screaming here. There was no aggressive competition for basic human decency. We had successfully built an environment where kindness was the primary currency and mutual respect was the unbreakable foundation. Occasionally, Arthur would forward me brief, highly clinical updates regarding the situation back in Texas. James and Flora were still hopelessly trapped in their decaying rental apartment, bitterly blaming the economy for their massive failures. Oriana had desperately attempted to launch a new social media channel under a fake pseudonym, but the internet is incredibly unforgiving, and her digital footprint had been permanently stained by her documented neglect. I read those updates with the detached, analytical precision of a structural engineer observing a failed, collapsed bridge. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate requires a massive expenditure of emotional energy, and I simply refused to invest another single drop of my life force into their bottomless void. They were no longer my family. They were merely biological strangers who had briefly inhabited my timeline. For 27 years, I had quietly believed that surviving a toxic environment required infinite silent endurance. I thought that if I just made myself small enough, useful enough, and completely invisible, I would eventually earn my rightful place in their empty hearts. But I was fundamentally wrong. Some structures are inherently designed to break your back. The only logical, healthy solution is to aggressively pack your tools, demolish the rotting framework, and walk away. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the peaceful European morning wash entirely over me. I looked at the little girl laughing warmly in my living room and the brilliant, deeply supportive man sitting right across from her. Blood is merely a biological accident. True legacy isn't what you inherit from your past. It is what you are brave enough to protect for your future. If this story reminded you of your own undeniable worth, hit subscribe and share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it today. Until next time, I finally found home.